Today, I'd like to introduce distinguished speaker, J. Keith Wilson. He is currently curator of ancient Chinese art at Freer Secular Museum as part of Smithsonian Institute. A specialist in Chinese antiquities, J. Keith Wilson received his BA in Chinese Studies from Williams College and completed his PhD coursework at Princeton University. After receiving MAs in Chinese art and archaeology from the University of Michigan and Princeton. He was also a research fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies on Asia at the University of Tokyo. He was just speaking to Mr. Murase in Japanese. He was appointed a curator at the Cleveland Museum of Art from the 80s and to 90s, and chief curator of Asian art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Since joining the Freer Secular in 2006, he has reinstalled the ancient Chinese art galleries in the Freer and launched a comprehensive digital catalog dedicated to the museum's early jade collections. Also interested in Japan, Chinese and Korean Buddhist art, Wilson co-organized the Echoes of the Past, Buddhist cave temples of Xiangtanshan in 2011. He also initiated a digital imaging and research tool dedicated to the Freer's renowned Cosmic Buddha, the subject of the monographic exhibition entitled Body of Devotion, 2016 and 17, and now an online feature. So you can actually visit this project, Cosmological Cosmic Buddha, at the Freer Secular's website. So please welcome Mr. Keith Wilson.
Great, thank you very much. Beginning in the late 19th century, art museums began to multiply across the United States, and here we're looking at the Freer Gallery of Art, where I work, that opened in 1923. Most began with a commitment to collecting and/or displaying works of art and providing some form of associated educational programming. Traditionally, teaching took place within the walls of the institutions, close to the primary or teaching collections. Instruction might combine the talents of curators and educators. Given the importance of physical objects in these efforts, it is not surprising that museums, and in many ways the curatorial profession, museum education, and the field of art history have come relatively late to the notion of globalized learning through emerging technologies. This morning, I'd like to track the brief history of IT-assisted museum programs and globalized access using a few projects I know personally. In many cases, they are things that I worked on myself. Despite a history of 2 short decades, the marriage between museums and the digital world has yielded notable successes, such as more widely shared resources, including images as well as archival and research information, new methods of research inspired by new tools, and at-home and lifelong learning opportunities facilitated by online demonstrations, podcasts, and apps. I'll focus on a few instances where things digital have been used to enhance understanding, broaden experience, further research, or encourage art making. Some can be experienced only within the museum setting, but most were designed to be accessible remotely too, thus contributing to Kyunghee's globalized classroom, represented by the bamboo canvas. Let's start with time-based media and museum galleries. This was my first experience with the innovative use of digital materials in art museums. And it came with my experience with a massive exhibition made in California that was organized by the Los Angeles County Museum of Art in 2000. At that time, I served as chief curator for Asian art. Organized to mark the millennium and explore art, image, and identity in California, the show naturally made extensive use of vintage film clips that were shown on small monitors throughout the exhibition. Well chosen, they supported key themes of the show and animated the gallery experience for visitors. I don't remember them being available beyond the gallery walls, however, and a search through archived LACMA web pages has not unearthed evidence of a wider distribution. No doubt, especially in those days, copyright restrictions limited exposure and usage. I'm sure other institutions, especially those dedicated to contemporary art, made equally creative early use of new digital commissions in those early years. It would be useful to survey how many were accessible beyond the museum on websites. I'd like now to turn to early research databases that were chiefly explored by universities. The first web-based Asian art history visual resource I knew about was the Shangtangshan Caves project that was initiated by the Center for the Art of East Asia at the University of Chicago. Begun in 2004, it's dedicated to 10 man-made Buddhist cave chapels that were hollowed out of the natural landscape in northern China during the third quarter of the 6th century. And in this slide, you can see the 3 imperially sponsored caves at the northern site, kind of about halfway up that mountainside. Not the largest Buddhist cave complex in northern China, the Shangtangshan Caverns happen to include extremely beautiful devotional sculpture, which made the site a prime target for looters in the early 20th century. Consequently, heads, hands, and entire figures were removed from the site to feed a hungry international art market, eager for impressive stone sculptures, suitable for public display in museum galleries. Largely emptied, the Shangtangshan Cave site was difficult for art historians to understand, and the removed fragments were typically acquired without information as to their source, making them kind of mysterious orphans. The UC Shangtangshan Cave project began as an attempt to identify and link the displaced fragments with their original locations in the caves. This effort was aided by 3D scanning. From the start, the UC team imagined using digital scans of museum objects and scans of the damaged or compromised cave settings to virtually reconstruct the original content and appearance of the site. The finished UC resource includes information and images on the caves and the displaced sculpture to encourage further study of the complex. And maybe we can take a quick look at the UC site. Remember, this is a relatively early one, 2004, 2005. The technology was very ambitious at the time, so there are nice high-res details of individual displaced sculptures. This one, as you can see in the label here, is in the Cleveland Museum. And the organizers of the site attribute it to a specific location within the cave complex. They also made use of the 3D models, which again, at this early date, are a little bit low res, but at least you have the capability of manipulating the images. And the goal here was really to use a 360 visibility of the images to allow this reconstruction process. In some cases, the hack marks on the backs of removed fragments could be directly associated with hack marks that were still present on the cave walls. I was particularly interested in the Caves project because, having moved to Washington in 2006, a couple of years after the site was launched, I was responsible for many important objects that were removed from this very site in the early 20th century. The Shangtangshan Caves project offered me an opportunity to draw attention to the site, its original meaning, its tragic destruction, and possibly explore virtual reconstructions using objects in my museum's collection. And in this slide, you can see a number of freer Shangtangshan sculptures along the back wall and the side wall. Thus, in 2010, we organized an exhibition on the site that brought together the UC-based web resource with some of the most important display sculptures in America. We had about 5 or 8 lenders, American museums. In the installation, we tried to suggest the original physical association of many of the removed pieces that had not been that close together in some cases 100 years, like these 3 standing images you see that would have come from the same cave originally. Likewise, these 7 images that are now spread across the world. We also commissioned an immersive room-sized video installation by the artist Jason Salavan to evoke the history of the site. And here I'm showing you just a couple of clips from that video installation. Salavan's piece blends scans of the displaced fragments, and you'll see them pop up in a kind of bright, luminous highlighter yellow, along with scans of the caves, accompanied by vintage photographs taken by Japanese survey teams that visited the site in the 1920s and 1930s. Personally, I learned a lot from this project, which represented a sophisticated use of digital imaging techniques to reconstruct a now vanished place. It was also my first lesson combining web-based elements with in-gallery experiences, the virtual as well as the physical. Although everything on display was available online, the emotive impact, especially of the virtual cave, a rear projection at original scale on 3 huge wall-sized screens and a dedicated space within the show, was probably more powerful than what you're seeing now on a single screen in this room. Meanwhile, museum websites. Unlike websites of research universities that we've been looking at, like the Chicago site, most early museum websites were dedicated to visitation and wayfinding, current exhibitions, special events, and fundraising. Offerings sometimes included flat pages made for classroom use by educators, but not nearly taking advantage of the robust capacity of this digital platform. Gradually, however, museum staff, especially curators, I think, recognized the platform's power to deliver the museum's permanent collection, both images and underlying information and research. Thus, most museum websites bifurcated into a hemisphere dedicated to marketing and communications, and a second dedicated to the permanent collection. The Freer-Sackler became an industry leader in this effort, making its entire collection available online with high-resolution images in January 2015. In fact, the Freer-Sackler was the first Smithsonian collection to be fully digitized and available online. We're very proud of that. Liberal terms of use ensure that the national collections can be easily accessed and researched and used for non-commercial purposes. Promotion of permanent collection projects has driven museum interest in online scholarly publications, allowing institutions to share their holdings with audiences internationally. In recognition of this trend, the Getty Foundation offered support for really the first generation of museum permanent collection digital catalogs starting in 2009. In large part, the Getty's OSCE initiative resulted in online publications that stood apart from museum collection databases, so essentially creating a siloed resource. We took a different approach with an online catalog I'm currently working on. Entitled Jades for Life and Death, the project was launched in 2014 and thus post-dated the Getty's initiative. It was inspired by the need to publish our outstanding collection of Han and pre-Han jades, which are accurately viewed as among the finest in the world. Because these collections are best studied comprehensively and comparatively, I decided that a digital platform made the most sense, especially given the scale of the anticipated checklist, which runs to over 1,000 objects. Given these numbers, we knew from the outset that the project needed to be approached incrementally. Again, the web is very good this way. We chose 5 period-based releases. Work on the first 2 volumes is now complete, so we're all the way done with the early Bronze Age. And we'll be finishing the next volume, the 3rd volume, in 2019. During the planning stages, we defined several core guidelines that framed our work. We're proud of the outcome, which is a flexible, multi-layered resource built by museum staff members, not outside contractors. It integrates a range of institutional resources stored on various databases and asset management systems seamlessly, and offers the potential for easy upgrades and almost infinite expansion. The catalog is visually striking, intuitive to use, and is sustainable for the museum. Its design, both the outward appearance and the underlying digital architecture, has been deemed so successful that Jades for Life and Death is serving now as the model for the present generation of all Freer and Sackler digital catalogs. In the interest of time, let's just look at one sample entry dedicated to this Neolithic ceremonial tube made about 5,000 years ago. Decorated with elaborate animal masks on its four corners, it's one of our highlights. So each entry is visually rich. Multiple views of each piece, study images like rubbings and measurement diagrams if we have them, group photos, and archival references. Each can be opened in an expandable and zoomable viewer, so you can get right into the detail of the surface. Basic caption data in both English and Chinese appears below the image viewer to the left, while more detailed information such as ownership history, curatorial notes, and unpublished research appears at the right. So the effort here is really to make our collection database as transparent to researchers as possible. This is just one object entry. This would be impossible in a standard print publication, obviously. The entries thus combine current understanding with material that is useful for historiographic studies in this particularly rapidly evolving field. Everything can be downloaded and everything can be printed anywhere in the world. At the very bottom of each entry, you'll see related objects, and each of these image tiles takes you to the entry for that object, as well as related media tiles. The related media tiles represent additional information, such as archival purchase records. So here we're seeing the details of the January 13th, 1916 transaction when Freer bought the tube that we've just been looking at. The archival materials that we're sharing here include Freer's handwritten purchase list that you can see here. This is our object. You can see that he paid $400 for it. You can see his check. And then the notes that were assembled on each object included in that purchase back in 1916. Now I'd like to turn to 3D permanent collection scanning projects, so moving away from the catalog to a more monographic study. You've already heard about in the introduction that Kyung-hee gave you. My experience with the Shangtangshan Caves project showed me the value of 3D scanning for object study. Early on, I was interested in adopting the technology for a different type of application, promoting interest in a very complex object, like the incredibly important 6th century cosmic Buddha sculpture that is in the center of this slide right here, that is in the collection. It may also be related to Shangtangshan both geographically and chronologically. The standing figure is a fragment, however, lacking its head and its hands. Anecdotally, I regularly saw visitors walk past it despite the fact that it is covered with shallow relief narratives that make it one of the most important early Buddhist sculptures in the world. I wondered if a 3D model would make the object both more attractive to visitors and easier for scholars to study and interpret. When we began to scan the object back in 2011, we had no idea how the scan might be used or how to deliver it to the research community or general visitors. It was one of the first projects undertaken by the Smithsonian's fledgling digitization program office, which at the time had 3 full-time staff members responsible for imaging across 30 Smithsonian units. I remember fondly spending several days with Vince and Adam, our laser cowboys, who carefully painted the image with handheld digital scanners. Within a year, however, we were beginning to make a plan for a web-based platform with a tech firm, Autodesk. When launched, it featured a small handful of iconic Smithsonian objects, including the Freer's Cosmic Buddha, termed the Smithsonian's Charter Collection. I'd like to take a few minutes to share the sculpture and the Smithsonian's 3D platform. The first function of the site is as a high-quality viewer with different presentation options and tools for study. Here we're looking at the highest resolution images of the sculpture. To include these high resolution images, however, we were only able to offer the primary viewpoints, front, back, sides, and top. They are, however, fully zoomable, and you don't lose any kind of detail when you get into the surface of the sculpture. Here we're looking at the back, and you can see it's dark, but you have user tools, specifically artificial light sources that allow you to illuminate the sculpture and study it in greater detail. A lower resolution version is more easily manipulated in space, so you can turn it and zoom it. You can use another selection of tools to make the surface a little bit easier to study by basically removing the photo texture and manipulating the occlusion of the surface. So all of a sudden, enhancing the contrast so that you can make much greater sense of the surface detail.
What is the age of the statue?
About the same period as Shangtangshan, so 3rd quarter of the 6th century. Since some of the scenes wrap around the sides of the sculpture, we also requested, greedy as we were, another imaging option, and that is a flat map that basically takes the 3D scan and rolls it out almost like an ink rubbing with very minimal distortion of the image. We asked also that this view clearly indicate the boundaries of the different narrative units, and it's all zoomable. So we've just been looking at a bunch of viewing tools, but the resource is also a reader, so you can embed content on the web source. Let's go back to the overall view. So the colored zones represent those same units that were broken out for you in the flat map, and these are all annotated, so you can get the basic content of each of those units. And specific figures are called out for specific identification. We could also embed short articles, topical pieces that help to explain those questions that we found users and visitors were most curious about. And the reader is very robust. It can take comparative images and links to other sources, allowing you to make easy comparisons with images worldwide. There's essentially infinite capacity on this site, so we've been able to work with students and specialists in a range of disciplines to write articles about the image and embed them in the viewer. Two years ago, when the Freer was closing for extensive renovations, we decided to move the sculpture itself into the Sackler and install it in a lab-like space with kiosks accessing the 3D site. The monographic show entitled Body of Devotion also included ink rubbings, traditional photographs, and 3D prints, raising questions about how objects have been imaged and studied over the centuries. The extensive labeling on the walls and online brought unprecedented attention to the sculpture and confirmed my notion that technology could incite and sustain interest in this very complex object. And it's all 3D printable. The success resulting from the 3D scan of the single object have encouraged us to think more ambitiously. I've been exploring the possibility of scanning entire collections. So I've been exploring the possibility of 3D scanning the entire collection of ancient Chinese bronzes to make the resource available online in a kind of digital catalog like we're doing for the jade catalog with flat 2D images. Most of the jades are flat anyway, so they don't really warrant 3D treatment. But for objects like these bronzes, treating them as three-dimensional objects I think is really important. And of course you can manipulate them in space almost as if you're holding them in your hands. For bronzes in particular, it's valuable because they were cast using a very complex ceramic piece mold system, and it's through tools like this that we can understand, I think, in greater detail how these objects were made. This piece was a bronze wine container made around 975 BCE. As we can see, researchers can also enhance the viewing and study experience by manipulating the viewer's digital tools and access annotations and articles like those we saw with the Cosmic Buddha. To be honest, however, we face a Herculean challenge with 3D imaging capacity since we have about 2,000 ancient bronzes that we'd like to make available. We're experimenting with rapid capture and snap processing methods, but do not yet have a satisfactory automated system that will allow us to safely capture a large number of objects at the desired level of resolution. So I guess on this one, more to come. The final examples I'd like to share this morning were created for an exhibition dedicated to ancient Chinese bells, music, and acoustics that is currently on view at the Sackler. Spanning the entire Bronze Age and reflecting both northern and southern musical traditions, the 60 or so examples on view vary in size, shape, decoration, and sound. Designed without clappers, most were suspended from racks and played with wooden mallets. Centuries of technological experimentation resulted in the ability of ancient casters to create sophisticated instruments that actually produced two different pitches when struck at different points on the surface. By the late Bronze Age, large sets of tuned bells were being created and played in ensembles, and you're seeing a still view of one of those performances behind a major piece in the exhibition. The culmination of the show is a graduated set of 6 bells created around the year 450 BCE, with each bell yielding 2 notes between a major and a minor third apart. This set produces 12 notes spread across an octave and a half. For the gallery presentation and also for the web, we created a digital tool that allows visitors to play the bells and see an approximation of the pitch on a keyboard. So you're hearing 2,500-year-old sounds. And they're reflected on the keyboard below, which you can also use as the entry point. You can see that each bell does indeed produce 2 different notes, whether you strike it at the center of the face or at the side. Although we can use technology to explore these ancient instruments and explain their acoustical properties, we know little about the sound of ancient Chinese music. Thus, rather than playing some hokey traditional folk song and trying to bring the bells to life, we decided to commission 3 composers to create contemporary soundscapes using the recorded 12 notes that you just heard on the 2,500-year-old Sackler bell set. Each of them also was asked to produce a video projection to interpret his composition with moving images and allow visitors to see sound. And here you're looking at the installation of that piece in the gallery setting. But all of that is also available on the web. We felt this was a useful device to make these ancient objects that are usually kind of slumbering in silence come alive for our museum visitors. I'd like to conclude my remarks this morning with a few brief insider observations on digital projects and their management. First, increasingly, the more interesting digital museum projects I know about internationally are inspired by work on museums' permanent collections. Freed from the pressures of time-sensitive loan exhibition workflows, these projects can be granted the time they need to develop and mature. They can also emerge from institutional